Chapter 1. The Colonies Before the Storm. In the year 1750, the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America were not yet a nation. They were scattered children of a distant empire, draped in British red and drinking tea under the flickering shadows of pine forests, tobacco plantations, and cobblestone streets. From the rocky coasts of Massachusetts to the humid marshlands of Georgia, these colonies were as varied as the lands they inhabited, each with its own rhythms, customs, and grudges, but all still tethered by law and loyalty to the crown across the Atlantic. At first glance, it might seem strange that men who would later cry for liberty once toasted the king with fervor. But in the 1750s, British identity was not a burden. It was a badge of pride. To be British was to belong to the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. The colonies, for all their roughness, considered themselves part of that story. In taverns and meeting houses, they cheered British victories and sang British songs. A Virginia planter spoke of Parliament with reverence. A Boston merchant boasted that his goods arrived on ships flying the Union Jack. Even those born generations after the Mayflower still saw England as home in spirit. This loyalty was not blind. It was rooted in convenience, in culture, and in commerce. Britain provided security. The mighty Royal Navy patrolled the seas, guarding colonial trade routes from pirates and foreign threats. Britain offered structure, a legal system, a sense of order, and a framework within which merchants could grow wealthy and planters could thrive. And Britain brought markets. For every barrel of Virginia tobacco, every plank of New England timber, every barrel of salted cod fished off Nova Scotia's coasts, there was a buyer waiting in London, Bristol, or Liverpool. Yet beneath this veneer of harmony, cracks had begun to form. The colonies were not monoliths. Each had its own government, its own ways, its own class of local elites. New England, shaped by Puritan discipline and cold soil, prized education, frugality, and community. Its towns were tight-knit and its churches well-attended. In contrast, the South basked in the wealth of its plantations, tobacco in Virginia, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, cultivated by enslaved laborers whose suffering propped up aristocratic mansions and gentlemen's leisure. The middle colonies, like Pennsylvania and New York, offered a kind of cultural crossroads. Dutch merchants, German farmers, Quaker pacifists, and frontier trappers coexisted in a rich and chaotic mosaic. Still, for all their differences, the colonies shared one growing trait: confidence. The population was booming. In 1700, about 250,000 people lived in British North America. By 1750, that number had swelled to over 1 million. Roads stretched farther inland. New towns sprang up like mushrooms after rain. And perhaps most importantly, a generation had arisen that had never seen England, never stepped foot in London's crowded streets or bowed before a royal procession. Their loyalties were learned, not lived. And they were beginning to ask questions. What, after all, was Britain doing for them lately? That question simmered quietly in 1754, the year the French and Indian War erupted, a conflict that would ignite the world and change everything. But before the war, there was still a sense that the colonies were Britain's good children. They paid their taxes mostly. They sent raw goods across the sea and bought back British wares in return. And they governed themselves, for the most part, through locally elected assemblies. Britain, distracted by European entanglements, was content to let them be. This lax arrangement, often called salutary neglect, gave the colonies room to breathe. It was in this breathing room that a unique American character began to take shape. In Boston, printers like Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Adams churned out newspapers that debated ideas of liberty, religion, and governance. In Virginia, men like George Washington were rising through the ranks of colonial society, forging reputations not by title, but by merit, ambition, and boldness. On the frontier, settlers carved out lives on the edge of the known world, confronting danger, isolation, and opportunity in equal measure. There was no single moment, no single law that began to fray the bond with Britain. Rather, it was a slow unspooling, subtle but steady. Part of it came from distance. To communicate with London took weeks, even months. A request made by a colonial governor could be answered by a royal decree long after the problem had changed. Colonists began to feel that their lives were governed by men who neither understood nor cared for their daily realities. There was also the matter of class. In Britain, society was rigid. A man was born into his station, and rarely did he rise above it. But in the colonies, something different was happening. The air smelled of possibility. A poor man could own land. An ambitious one could start a business. There was a sense that the rules were looser here, that destiny was something you could shape with your hands, your wits, and your will. The colonists were still loyal, but it was a loyalty increasingly laced with independence. They respected the king, but they were used to solving their own problems. They honored British tradition, but they were inventing their own. A preacher in New Hampshire didn't need royal approval to speak his mind. A printer in Philadelphia didn't ask Parliament which ideas were safe to publish. And a farmer in North Carolina didn't need a London gentleman to tell him how to plant his fields or raise his sons. The seeds of rebellion were already in the soil. All it would take was rain. And the storm clouds were gathering. When the French and Indian War broke out, the colonies rallied to Britain's cause. Young George Washington, just 22, led troops into battle in the Ohio Valley. Colonial militias raised muskets to defend the frontier. They saw the war as their war, fought on their land for their security. But when the war ended in 1763, the gratitude they expected never arrived. Instead, Britain sent soldiers and bills. The war had cost the empire dearly. The British government, drowning in debt, looked across the Atlantic and saw the colonies not as loyal children, but as undertaxed beneficiaries. Parliament reasoned that since the war had been fought partly to protect colonial interests, the colonists should help pay for it. New taxes were passed, new laws enforced, and the tone from London began to shift, from neglect to control. To many colonists, it felt like a betrayal. They had bled for Britain. They had lost fathers, sons, and friends on distant fields. And now they were to be taxed, not by their own assemblies, but by men in Parliament they had never met, who had never set foot on American soil. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. They had governed themselves for decades. Now they were being treated like unruly subjects who needed discipline. Still, few called for revolution, at least not yet. But the conversations had begun. In candlelit rooms, in crowded taverns, in sermons and editorials and whispered exchanges, a new question was rising. What did it mean to be British if Britain no longer respected them? Some still clung to hope. Surely Parliament would see reason. Surely the king would intervene. Surely this was all a misunderstanding. But others were less patient. They remembered how the crown had sent soldiers to enforce its will. They remembered the blood spilled on frontier soil. They watched as British officials dismissed colonial petitions, shut down dissent, and sent troops not to protect, but to police. And they began to wonder, what if the colonies weren't children of the empire anymore? What if they were something else? A new generation was rising. A generation born in America, shaped by its land, hardened by its wars, and awakened by its ideas. They read Locke and Montesquieu. They quoted scripture and spoke of liberty. They held grudges against the taxman and dreams of a future their ancestors couldn't imagine. In 1750, the colonies were British in name, custom, and loyalty. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. They were no longer merely subjects. They were becoming Americans. And though they did not know it yet, the storm they had feared and perhaps needed was already on its way. Chapter 2. Debt, Taxes, and British Arrogance. Victory should have been sweet. In 1763, after nearly a decade of war, the British Empire stood triumphant. The French had been driven from Canada, their forts in the Ohio Valley reduced to ash or handed over in surrender. The map of North America had been redrawn in Britain's favor, its imperial reach stretching from the icy cliffs of Nova Scotia to the tropical sugar islands of the Caribbean. And yet, in the shadow of victory, the seeds of discontent began to take root, watered not by blood, but by paper, stamps, and coin. The French and Indian War had changed everything. For the British, it had been costly, horrifically so. The national debt had nearly doubled, climbing to over £130 million, a staggering sum for the time. Parliament, already grappling with tax resistance and economic pressure at home, turned its eyes westward. The colonies, they reasoned, had benefited directly from the war. It was their frontier that had been defended, their homes that had been protected, their futures that had been secured. Shouldn't they help pay for it? For the colonists, the logic seemed sound, until they read the fine print. The first sign of the coming storm arrived quietly, folded into barrels of molasses and crates of sugar. The Sugar Act of 1764 was meant to regulate trade and generate revenue by lowering the tax on imported molasses but enforcing it more strictly. The law also added new duties on wine, silk, coffee, and other goods. On paper, it seemed minor. But for New England merchants, who relied heavily on smuggling and trading with non-British colonies, it struck like a dagger. What had once been a tolerated gray market was now a punishable offense. The colonial economy, already fragile, began to tremble. Still, the backlash was cautious. There were petitions, editorials, and grumblings in taverns. But most colonists hoped the law would pass like a bad winter. It was the next act, the one that taxed the very paper on which their protests were written, that ignited something deeper. The Stamp Act of 1765 was different. It wasn't about trade, it was about life. For the first time, Parliament imposed a direct tax on the colonies, requiring that virtually all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, licenses, even playing cards, carry a stamp purchased from British authorities. Without the stamp, the document was invalid. To British officials, this seemed reasonable. The tax was small. The stamps were easy to obtain. The colonies, after all, were part of the empire. But to the colonists, it was something else entirely. It was a red line. This wasn't just about money. It was about authority. Parliament was taxing them without their consent, without their representation. No colonial voice sat in Westminster. No colonial vote had approved this law. And if Parliament could tax paper today, what would it tax tomorrow? Across the colonies, the response was swift and fierce. Newspapers printed fiery denunciations. Pamphlets some anonymous, others boldly signed, circulated in coffeehouses and meeting halls. In Boston, a new group emerged, the Sons of Liberty, a loose network of craftsmen, merchants, and firebrands who took resistance into the streets. Effigies of tax collectors were hanged from trees. Mobs formed. Offices were ransacked. One official, Andrew Oliver, was burned in effigy and saw his house attacked, windows shattered, furniture looted. He resigned the next day. It was not a revolution yet, but it was no longer just dissent. For the first time, ordinary people had risen in open defiance of the Crown's authority, and Parliament noticed. Shaken by the scale of the backlash and pressured by British merchants who feared losing colonial customers, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Bells rang across the colonies. Barrels of rum were cracked open in celebration. The king was praised. Peace, it seemed, had returned. But just a few months later, a new law arrived, one that left a bitter aftertaste in every toast. The Declaratory Act, passed alongside the repeal, stated that Parliament had the absolute right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The wording was clear. The message was clearer. We can do this again, and next time you may not like the terms. That next time came faster than many expected. In 1767, a new set of duties was introduced by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. The Townshend Acts taxed imports of glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, all everyday goods. The revenue would be used not just to support British troops, but to pay colonial governors and judges directly, bypassing colonial assemblies. To many colonists, this was more dangerous than the tax itself. If governors no longer relied on colonial funding, they could ignore colonial will. Self-government was under threat. Boycotts erupted. Women, often the ones purchasing these household goods, became central to the resistance, refusing British fabrics, brewing herbal liberty teas, and supporting domestic production. Merchants signed agreements to stop importing taxed goods. Tensions rose in every port and market. But while goods were taxed and speeches made, something more ominous was happening on the ground. British soldiers were arriving, not as defenders, but as enforcers. The Quartering Act, passed in 1765 and renewed in 1774, required colonial governments to provide housing and supplies for British troops stationed in America. At first, it seemed harmless, an administrative burden more than a political one. But as soldiers arrived in greater numbers, especially in cities like New York and Boston, the presence felt oppressive. Redcoats patrolled the streets, lounged in taverns, and occupied homes and public buildings. Skirmishes broke out between soldiers and civilians. Tension became part of daily life. Nowhere was that tension more visible than in Boston. By 1770, the city was a powder keg. British troops were everywhere. The press stoked flames of resentment. Street fights between colonists and soldiers became common. Then, on the cold night of March 5th, it happened. A mob formed in front of the custom house. Snowballs flew, some with rocks inside. British soldiers, cornered and nervous, raised their muskets. A shout, a slip, a shot. No one knew which came first. But when the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, often remembered as the first to fall in the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be called, was a tragedy, but also a spark. Paul Revere's engraving of the scene spread like wildfire, painting the British as bloodthirsty murderers. Colonial outrage soared. The soldiers were tried, 2 found guilty of manslaughter, none of murder. But the damage was done. The word massacre echoed in sermons, newspapers, and town meetings. The colonies were not just being taxed, they were being occupied, punished, killed. Still, the rebellion had no leader. No single colony claimed the cause. There was no army, no declaration, no demand for independence. Only a growing sense of violation and a memory of what it meant to govern themselves. In 1773, Britain handed the colonists another gift-wrapped insult. To save the struggling British East India Company, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants and enforcing a small but symbolic tax. The tea was cheaper, but buying it meant submitting to Parliament's right to tax. The colonists saw the trap. In Boston, the response was legendary. On a chilly December night, a group of men, some dressed as Mohawk warriors, others simply masked, boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The sea turned black with leaves. The Boston Tea Party was an act of rebellion cloaked in theater. It thrilled the colonies. It enraged the crown. Punishment followed swiftly. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. Town meetings were restricted. The Quartering Act was strengthened. The Massachusetts Charter was effectively suspended. Instead of crushing the rebellion, the acts united the colonies. Sympathy for Boston spread like fire. Supplies were sent, assemblies convened. And in September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Not yet a government, not yet a revolution, but something new. A union of voices, testing the boundaries of loyalty and resolve. And so, in just over a decade, the colonies had gone from loyal subjects to watchful critics, from boycotters to resistors, from peaceful petitioners to masked saboteurs. What had begun as a war for empire had become something else, an awakening. The debt Britain sought to recover through taxes had instead accrued in anger, in pride, and in the ink of newspapers and the blood on snowy streets. And as the snow melted and the spring of 1775 approached, so too did the sound of footsteps in the dark. Riders saddling horses, militias cleaning muskets, and the inevitable click of destiny drawing near. The storm that had long been building was about to break. Chapter 3. Sons of Liberty. The snow fell in soft silence, blanketing Boston in a deceptive calm. Beneath its peaceful white cover, however, the city was boiling. British redcoats patrolled its narrow streets, their boots crunching on the icy cobblestones, eyes wary beneath tricorn hats. Colonists moved past them with narrowed gazes and clenched jaws. The greetings were stiff. The air held no warmth. And the city, once a proud jewel of the New World, had become a powder keg. The rebellion had not yet begun with rifles and armies. It began in shadows and whispers, in back rooms and basements, with words scratched in ink and muttered in hushed tones. The Sons of Liberty were not generals or kings. They were printers, brewers, blacksmiths, lawyers, men of ordinary lives, but extraordinary conviction. They knew that Parliament would not listen to petitions. They believed that change would come not through pleasantries, but pressure. And they intended to apply it. Their weapons were not muskets, at least not yet. Their weapons were pamphlets and protests, symbols and spectacle. Their battlefield was the street, the tavern, the printed page. And in the years following the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, they made Boston their stronghold. At the center of this movement stood Samuel Adams, a wiry, intense figure with fire in his voice and ink on his fingers. Adams understood that ideas were as powerful as armies. He co-founded committees of correspondence, spreading news of British abuses from colony to colony, building a sense of unity in a land that had long been fragmented. His cousin, John Adams, quieter but no less committed, watched the chaos with the cautious eyes of a lawyer, weighing rights against rebellion. Together, they laid the groundwork for resistance. The Sons of Liberty became Boston's underground conscience. They organized boycotts, pressured merchants, and tarred and feathered those who sided with the crown. Loyalist officials became pariahs. Imported goods were shamed and shunned. British soldiers were watched, baited, provoked. In their eyes, every redcoat was a walking insult, a symbol of foreign oppression in the heart of a free people. Protest became performance. Effigies of tax collectors were strung from liberty trees. Crowds gathered to mock them, cheer their symbolic deaths, and demand resignations. These events were not just emotional outlets. They were calculated acts of psychological warfare. The message was clear. Power belonged not in London, but in the people gathered in Boston's squares. By 1768, tensions had reached such a pitch that the British government sent troops, 4 regiments of regulars, to restore order. They landed with drums and discipline, but the colonists saw them not as peacekeepers, but invaders. Red in coat and face alike, the soldiers stood out in every alley and at every corner. Drunken fights broke out. Children threw snowballs. Women turned their backs. Merchants refused service. And behind it all, the Sons of Liberty recorded each offense, each insult, and sent them down the pipeline to other colonies like sparks leaping from torch to torch. The streets became contested ground. Taverns buzzed with rumor and resentment. British soldiers, poorly paid and poorly housed, competed with local men for jobs and lodging. Civilians bristled at their presence, their arrogance, their bayonets. And then came that night. March 5th, 1770. The evening began with grumbles. A soldier posted outside the custom house had been taunted, called names, pelted with snow and ice. More colonists gathered. Shouts turned to jeers, more snowballs, then clubs, then rocks. The soldier called for help. Reinforcements arrived. A small squad of redcoats, led by Captain Thomas Preston, stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing cold, backs to the wall, muskets raised. The crowd surged. Some say a club struck a soldier. Others claim someone shouted, "Fire!" A shot rang out, then another, then chaos. In seconds, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. Among them was Crispus Itux, a man of African and native descent, a former slave and sailor, whose blood was the first spilled. The white snow turned red. The street went silent, and America changed forever. The event was brutal, confused, messy. No one truly knew who gave the order, or if there even was an order. But truth mattered less than the image. Within days, Paul Revere had carved an engraving, "The Bloody Massacre in King Street," showing British soldiers firing in formation upon a helpless, peaceful crowd. It was propaganda at its most powerful. And it worked. The image spread through the colonies like wildfire, igniting anger in places as distant as Charleston and New Haven. The British government scrambled to contain the damage. Captain Preston and 8 of his soldiers were arrested and put on trial. In a twist of fate, John Adams, ever the lawyer, agreed to defend them, arguing that law must stand even in times of chaos. His defense was calm, methodical, and persuasive. Most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the hand. But for many in Boston, no verdict could undo the blood in the street or the fear in their hearts. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. It marked the first time colonists had died at the hands of British soldiers in a time of so-called peace. It showed that the Crown would use force to suppress dissent. And it revealed, perhaps most importantly, that the colonies were no longer just debating taxes. They were now standing in open defiance. After the massacre, the streets grew quieter, but not calmer. The British withdrew some of their troops from Boston. Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties except the tax on tea. That one remained. Small, symbolic, a reminder. The tea tax was not about revenue. It was about control, about the principle that Parliament could legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonies did not forget. The Sons of Liberty did not disband. They watched. They organized. They wrote. Pamphleteers like Thomas Hutchinson and James Otis argued in public and in print over the rights of Englishmen in America. Otis famously declared, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." The phrase would become a drumbeat for revolution. In Philadelphia, Charleston, and New York, similar groups emerged, echoes of the Boston Sons, fighting the same fight with different voices. A shared sense of purpose was forming. The colonies, once isolated, were becoming a network, a cause, a community. British arrogance, for its part, did not wane. Officials in London viewed the colonists as unruly children, spoiled by too much freedom and too little discipline. They believed the crisis in Boston was an isolated incident, a fluke of hotheads and radicals. What they failed to see was that the entire Atlantic coast was listening, watching, waiting. As the 1770s marched forward, it became clear that a line had been crossed. No one yet called for independence, but fewer and fewer believed that things would return to how they once were. The colonies had tasted unity. They had seen British blood drawn on American soil. They had felt power in the hands of ordinary men. The snow of Boston had melted, but the blood remained. The next spark, when it came, would not be cleaned so easily. And as the ships creaked in Boston harbor, their hulls heavy with taxed tea, the men of the city began to whisper once more. The Sons of Liberty were not finished. The ink was not dry. And the fight, still young, was only beginning. Chapter 4. The Boston Tea Party and British Retaliation. The water of Boston harbor was calm on the night of December 16, 1773. It lapped gently against the wooden hulls of 3 ships docked at Griffin's Wharf: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, each one loaded with crates of East India Company tea. Above deck, no lanterns flickered. No sailors stood watch. Below deck, hundreds of chests sat sealed, filled with leaves grown on the other side of the world. They had crossed oceans to be sold under a law no one in Boston wanted. And soon, they would never be sold at all. On shore, a crowd had gathered under the wintry sky. Some were curious, some were angry. All had come to witness something. No one knew exactly what. Inside the Old South Meeting House, thousands had packed shoulder to shoulder, a breath clouding in the cold, voices rising in frustration. Negotiations had failed. The governor, Thomas Hutchinson, had refused to allow the ships to leave without unloading their cargo. The law demanded the tea be taxed and sold. The people refused. Now, something had to break. Then a shout, a signal, a roar of approval, and the crowd surged toward the harbor. They came in disguise, some dressed as Mohawk warriors, others cloaked in rags and soot, faces painted and identities hidden. But make no mistake, these were not drunken vandals. This was theater with purpose, symbolism with teeth. Organized and disciplined, the men boarded the ships and, one by one, hoisted the crates from the holds and smashed them open. The tea, fortunes of it, poured into the sea. Not a single drop was stolen. No one was harmed. Nothing was burned. It was an act of defiance executed with precision. By morning, the harbor stank of damp leaves and salt water. The news traveled fast, faster than any horse or ship. By the end of the week, the story had leapt from Boston to New York, from Charleston to Philadelphia. In every colony there were cheers, toasts, and whispers. The British crown had been mocked, not with violence, but with symbolism. And London was not amused. Parliament's response was not measured. It was not cautious. It was punishment, pure and simple. In the spring of 1774, a series of laws was passed with ruthless clarity. Their official name was the Coercive Acts. The colonists had another name for them, the Intolerable Acts. The first act was a dagger aimed at the city itself. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the tea was paid for, effectively strangling the city's economy. Ships were turned away. Trade froze. Fishermen, merchants, dock workers, all suffered. It didn't matter that most had nothing to do with the Tea Party. Boston would be made an example. The second law gutted the colony's governance. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter, replaced elected councils with royal appointees, and stripped town meetings of their power. Where once there had been debate, now there would be decree. Then came the Administration of Justice Act, nicknamed by colonists the Murder Act. It allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England or another colony, far from colonial juries. Justice, once local, was now to be exported, perhaps never to return. And finally, the Quartering Act was revived and strengthened. Troops could now be housed in any building Parliament deemed necessary, be it barn, tavern, or private home. The redcoats were not leaving. They were moving in. But something unexpected happened. Instead of isolating Boston, the Crown united the colonies. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Boston. Merchants from New York and Philadelphia sent supplies: flour, rice, livestock. What had once been a local protest now felt like a shared fate. If they could do this to Boston, they could do it anywhere. Colonial leaders began to talk, to write, to organize. The idea of a united front, once far-fetched, now seemed necessary. If the British would not treat the colonies as equal subjects, perhaps they would need to act not as scattered children, but as one people. And so, in September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia being the only exception, met in Philadelphia. They gathered not to declare independence, but to assert rights, to demand repeal, to present a united voice. This was the First Continental Congress, and though its delegates were cautious, even divided in temperament, they all felt the weight of the moment. Men like Patrick Henry, John Adams, George Washington, and Samuel Adams met behind closed doors. They debated the extent of Parliament's power, the nature of liberty, and the limits of protest. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, affirming loyalty to the crown but rejecting taxation without representation. They agreed to form the Continental Association, a boycott of British goods. They urged colonies to form militias, not yet armies, but seeds of something larger. In London, none of this softened Parliament's resolve. The King's ministers saw the Congress not as diplomats, but rebels in disguise. The Crown would not negotiate with insurgents. And so preparations for war quietly began. In the towns and villages of Massachusetts, men began to drill. Muskets were oiled, powder was stored. The term Minutemen entered the colonial vocabulary, men who would be ready to fight at a moment's notice. Across the countryside, old fears returned. Stories of redcoats abusing civilians were passed from porch to pulpit. Spies reported movements. Patriots watched the roads. But not all were ready for open conflict. Many still hoped for reconciliation. They believed the king, once made aware of their plight, would intervene. That this was all the fault of Parliament, corrupt, distant, out of touch. They wrote letters. They sent emissaries. They prayed. But the tea had already sunk. The harbor had already closed. The troops were already marching. Back in Boston, the British tightened their grip. General Thomas Gage, appointed governor of Massachusetts, commanded thousands of troops. He watched the surrounding countryside with growing concern. He knew militias were training. He knew arms were being stockpiled. He believed that with one swift strike, he could seize the weapons, arrest the troublemakers, and end the resistance before it spread. He was wrong. The tension was no longer just political. It was personal. Every colonist knew someone who had lost work, lost trade, or lost faith in the crown. Every family had been touched by the crackdown. And every meeting, every sermon, every whispered conversation carried the scent of change. The Sons of Liberty, once confined to Boston, had become a network across the colonies. Their letters were coded, their messages hidden in books or spoken in lantern-lit barns. The idea of liberty, once vague and philosophical, was now immediate and visceral. And tea, once a symbol of civility, had become a symbol of tyranny. In taverns, men refused it. In homes, women poured it out. It wasn't just a drink. It was a test of allegiance, a statement of loyalty, a reminder that the crown saw them not as citizens, but as subjects. And then came the moment when talk would no longer be enough. The First Continental Congress adjourned with no answers, only promises to reconvene. Delegates returned home to prepare. For what, they were not entirely sure. But they knew it was coming. The mood in the colonies was no longer one of reform. It was one of readiness. The tea had been dumped. The laws had been passed. The lines had been drawn. And in the spring of 1775, on a road leading west of Boston, where the frost was just beginning to melt and the air smelled of damp soil and gunpowder, those lines would be crossed. Because tyranny, once exposed, demands a reckoning. And the reckoning was just one shot away. Chapter 5. Lexington and Concord. The night was still. A pale moon hung over the Massachusetts countryside, casting long shadows across dirt roads and silent fields. Spring had arrived, but the air still held a chill. In the distance, the Charles River glistened in the moonlight, a quiet witness to the storm about to break. Inside Boston, British troops prepared in silence. Boats were readied, muskets loaded, orders passed down the chain of command with grave urgency. General Thomas Gage, governor and commander of British forces, had made his decision. On April 19th, 1775, The king's soldiers would march to Concord to seize weapons hidden by colonial militias and arrest the rebel leaders rumored to be nearby. But the colonies were no longer asleep. For weeks, intelligence networks built by the Sons of Liberty had tracked British movements. Every order, every whisper, seemed to reach colonial ears. And now, with Gage's plan set into motion, lanterns were lit in Boston's North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, and two riders prepared to gallop into history. Paul Revere was a silversmith by trade, a courier by necessity, and a revolutionary by conviction. Alongside him rode William Dawes, a quieter man, no less brave. Their mission was clear: to warn the countryside that British regulars were on the move, not for drills, not for show, but for war. Revere rode hard into the night, his horse pounding over wooden bridges and narrow paths, shouting to each village as he passed. "The regulars are coming out?" It was not a cry of panic, but of preparation. In Lexington, the town's militia was already stirring when Revere arrived. Lanterns flickered in windows. Muskets were pulled from walls. Farmers rubbed sleep from their eyes and stepped into the cold, knowing the day ahead might change their world forever. Among them were 70 or so men, ordinary citizens, not soldiers, who stood on Lexington Green, hearts pounding, hands steady. They waited. At sunrise, the red line appeared on the road. British regulars, nearly 700 strong, approached with polished bayonets and grim faces. Their commander, Major John Pitcairn, shouted at the militia to disperse. The colonists, outnumbered 10-1, began to back away. And then it happened. A shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. A spark in the wrong place, a misfire, a trembling finger, it didn't matter. The silence shattered, the world shifted, and musket fire lit the morning sky. In the chaos, 8 colonists fell dead. 10 more were wounded. The British suffered only 1 injured soldier. The militia scattered, the regulars pressed on, and the war, though no one had declared it yet, had begun. The soldiers marched to Concord. Their orders were clear: confiscate arms, destroy powder, and, if possible, arrest the rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the countryside had already answered Revere's call. Militias were assembling from every direction. The alarm had been raised in dozens of towns. Bells rang, drums beat, riders flew in all directions. It was no longer one village, it was a region rising. By the time the British reached Concord, the weapons they had come to seize had been hidden or moved. Frustrated, they searched the town, found little, and set fire to some supplies. But on the hills outside the village, hundreds of armed colonists gathered, watching, waiting. The British began their return march to Boston, but this time they were not alone. From behind stone walls and tree lines, the militias struck, not in one grand battle, but in waves of ambushes and skirmishes. A gunshot here, a volley there. A redcoat fell, then another. The retreat became a gauntlet. The regulars, trained for open-field warfare, found themselves harried by an invisible enemy. Farmers, blacksmiths, preachers, every one of them an American with a musket and a cause. By the time the British stumbled back into Boston, exhausted and bloodied, they had suffered over 250 casualties, nearly 3 times that of the colonists. What was supposed to be a quick operation had become a humiliating retreat. The news spread faster than any army could march. In taverns and churches, the story was told and retold. How the mighty British Army had been outmaneuvered by men in homespun coats. How the colonies had stood their ground. how the first shot had been fired and the line between protest and war had finally been crossed. In London, the reaction was stunned silence, followed by disbelief and then rage. Parliament declared the colonies in open rebellion. Reinforcements were ordered, warships readied. The full weight of the empire would soon descend upon America. But in the colonies, something extraordinary was happening. Where once there had been 13 separate colonies, there was now a shared identity forming, one built on blood, resistance, and a dream of freedom. Local militias gathered into larger forces. Farmers left their fields. Merchants closed their shops. Blacksmiths forged bullets instead of horseshoes. From Virginia to New Hampshire, men volunteered to fight, to march, to die if needed. A makeshift army encamped outside Boston. Among its ranks were men from every walk of life. They lacked uniforms, discipline, even shoes. But they had something stronger than fear. They had purpose, and they needed a commander. The Second Continental Congress convened in May of 1775. Though still hesitant to speak of independence, its members knew that the conflict was no longer political. It was military. They needed leadership. They needed a figure who could unite the colonies and lead the fight. They chose a tall, quiet man from Virginia, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a man of few words and firm resolve. His name was George Washington. He did not seek glory. He accepted the command with solemnity. He knew what it meant. He understood the cost. As he took command of the Continental Army, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a servant of a cause greater than himself. Meanwhile, in Boston, British forces remained trapped. The city was under siege. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared. In June, the colonists fortified the heights outside the city. The British struck back. The result was the Battle of Bunker Hill, a brutal, bloody engagement that left over 1,000 British soldiers dead or wounded. Though the colonists ultimately retreated, the cost to the British was staggering. The message was clear: this would not be a quick war. The Americans would not back down. But the fight was not just on battlefields. It was in hearts and minds, in pamphlets passed from hand to hand, in sermons spoken from pulpits, in whispered prayers and shouted speeches. The colonies had been pushed too far. The tea, the taxes, the troops, and now the bullets. The spark lit at Lexington, and Concord had set fire to an empire. Yet still, the door was not completely closed. Some in Congress hoped for reconciliation, a final appeal to the king, a plea for understanding. But George III was no longer listening. He had already made his choice, and so had the colonies. The path forward was war, and war would demand sacrifice. But for the first time in the long, stormy history of British America, the people of the 13 colonies looked not to London for their future, but to each other. A revolution had begun, not with a declaration, not with a grand speech, but with a single shot fired on a quiet morning in April. A shot that still echoes today. The shot heard round the world. Chapter 6. Patriots, Loyalists, and the Fence-Sitters. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air after Lexington and Concord. Across the colonies, church bells rang and muskets were cleaned. Militia companies drilled on village greens while anxious mothers watched from porches. The British had fired, and the colonists had fired back. But now, the question that had long been whispered in taverns and parlors could no longer be ignored. Would the colonies break away? Would they truly rebel against king and country? And more personally, where did each man and woman stand? It was a question that tore through towns and families alike. For all the shouts of liberty and cries of tyranny, the colonies were not united. Not yet. Not everyone wanted independence. Not everyone saw rebellion as the path forward. While some hoisted banners and pledged themselves to the patriot cause, others held fast to loyalty, to Britain, to law and tradition. And still others, perhaps the majority, stood somewhere in the fog between, uncertain, hesitant, caught between loyalty and liberty. In the streets of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, the lines were becoming clearer. Patriots, those who supported resistance to British rule, began to assert control. They organized committees of safety. They monitored trade. They watched their neighbors. In some towns, they seized control of local governments entirely. They tarred and feathered loyalist officials, demanded oaths of allegiance, and punished those who refused. For many, revolution was no longer a debate. It was a duty. To question it was to risk being labeled a traitor. But not everyone saw the patriot cause as righteous. Loyalists, or Tories, as they were derisively called, viewed the rebellion with horror. Some were wealthy merchants who feared the loss of trade with Britain. Others were Anglican ministers who had sworn oaths to the crown. Some were former British soldiers or landowners who had prospered under imperial rule. But many were simply people who feared chaos more than tyranny. They believed that the patriots were reckless, dangerous, and driven by pride. They saw the king not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of order in a violent and uncertain world. For these loyalists, life in the colonies became a tightrope. Speaking too freely could bring the wrath of neighbors. Refusing to support the patriot cause could lead to exile or worse. In some towns, loyalists were branded with hot irons, forced to flee their homes, or paraded through streets to the jeers of angry crowds. Their lands were seized, their businesses boycotted, their churches burned. The revolution was becoming not just a war against Britain, but a civil war within. The social divide was sharp. The patriot movement often drew strength from artisans, tradesmen, small farmers, and the educated middle class, people who had long felt excluded from the power structures of the British Empire. They saw in the revolution a chance to break old hierarchies and forge something new. Loyalists, on the other hand, were often from the colonial elite. They feared that revolution would tear down the very society they had helped build. They looked to London not as a foreign power, but as a partner. Their loyalty was not blind. It was born of investment, heritage, and identity. And then there were those who didn't choose at all. Fence-sitters, the cautious, the conflicted, the majority. These were the people who lived far from city centers and battlefields. Farmers who needed to tend their crops more than wave a flag. Blacksmiths who needed customers more than causes. Widows who feared losing sons. Shopkeepers who stocked British goods. They listened to both sides. They nodded politely. They made no promises. Some were waiting to see who would win. Others were simply too weary or too afraid to choose. But neutrality was rarely safe. Both sides demanded allegiance. Both sides distrusted silence. In the north, small towns split down the middle. In the south, the divide was even more complex. Wealthy planters were often patriots, seeing British taxes as threats to their autonomy. But poorer settlers in the backcountry sometimes sided with the crown, believing that rebellion served only the elite. And within all this, there were voices too often left out of the debate. For enslaved Africans and African Americans, the revolution posed a cruel dilemma. Patriots spoke of liberty, but many owned slaves. Some promised freedom to those who fought, but only after the war. The British, seeing an opportunity, offered immediate freedom to any enslaved person who fled a patriot master and joined the Royal Army. Thousands did. They crossed battle lines, braved punishment, and sought a freedom that neither side was truly prepared to grant. For Native American nations, the war was a nightmare. Many tribes had long-standing trade relationships with the British, and they feared that an independent America would bring more settlers, more land theft, more broken promises. Some allied with the Crown, others with the colonists. Still others tried to remain neutral. But all knew that no matter who won, their world would be changed forever. Even among the patriots, there were divisions. Some wanted full independence immediately. Others still clung to the hope that reconciliation was possible. In cities like Philadelphia, delegates debated late into the night. Were they rebels or reformers? Were they fighting for new rights or just the restoration of old ones? Was the king the enemy or merely misled? And among loyalists, there were quiet doubts. Could Britain truly hold the colonies by force? Were the patriots really just a noisy minority? Or did they speak for more people than they seemed? If the revolution succeeded, what would become of those who had sided with the Crown? Would there be mercy or retribution? The revolution was no longer a clean contest of ideas. It was a messy, personal, painful transformation. Brothers stood on opposite sides of battle lines. Fathers watched sons take up arms against the king. Entire families fled their homes, driven out not by foreign armies, but by neighbors who had once shared meals and prayers. And yet, in the chaos, something was taking shape. A new identity, an American identity, not born of sameness, but of shared struggle. The decision to rebel or not was no longer just political. It was moral, emotional, and inescapable. There would be no going back. Each man, each woman, would have to reckon with their choice. Some would do so quietly, others would speak loudly, march boldly, and fight fiercely. But all of them, patriot, loyalist, or in between, were now part of a drama far greater than any had imagined. The colonies were not just fighting Britain, they were defining themselves. And soon they would give that identity a name. But before they could, there would be more battles to fight, more cities to burn, and more hearts to break. Because the war was only just beginning, and every side, every voice, every choice would shape what came next. Chapter 7. Thomas Jefferson and the Birth of a Nation. The year was 1776, and the colonies stood on the edge of transformation. War had already begun. Bullets had already flown. Blood had already been spilled. But though the sound of muskets echoed through the countryside, the revolution still lacked its voice. A rebellion needed more than anger. It needed purpose. It needed words. And on a hot summer day in Philadelphia, inside a stuffy hall where tempers flared and wigs itched and flies buzzed through open windows, the colonies finally gave their cause a name. Independence. It had not come easily. Even as militias skirmished with redcoats and patriot leaders were hunted as traitors, the Second Continental Congress remained cautious. Many delegates still clung to the hope of reconciliation. Others feared that declaring independence would doom them to the gallows. Some simply believed that unity among the colonies was too fragile to risk bold action. But the war had made the question unavoidable. If they were to fight Britain, they needed to be something more than British subjects. They needed to be a nation. Throughout the spring of 1776, the momentum shifted. News of British atrocities, real and imagined, filled newspapers. George Washington's troops endured shortages and disease outside Boston. Common Sense, a blistering pamphlet by Thomas Paine, swept through the colonies like wildfire, selling over 100,000 copies in its first few months. In it, Paine argued not for patience, but for revolution. He mocked monarchy, rejected compromise, and urged Americans to shake off the chains of empire and create a new republic. The pamphlet struck a chord. For many, it was a revelation. For others, it was the final push they needed. By June, the debate could be delayed no longer. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood and introduced a simple resolution: that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The words were bold, clear, and irreversible. Congress hesitated. The delegates were not yet ready to vote, but they were ready to prepare. A committee was formed to draft a declaration. 5 men were appointed: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a quiet, red-haired Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. It was Jefferson who did the writing. He was just 33 years old, but already known for his elegant prose and sharp intellect. A planter, a lawyer, a man of science and philosophy, Jefferson saw language not as decoration, but as weaponry. He shut himself in a rented room on Market Street, with a violin in the corner, a feather quill in hand, and volumes of Enlightenment thought stacked beside him. And then, in a few feverish days, he wrote words that would change the world. He began not with grievances, but with ideals. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he wrote, "that all men are created equal." The phrase struck like thunder. In an age of kings and empires, of rigid class and inherited privilege, Jefferson's sentence was a challenge to the entire structure of society. It was also a contradiction, given the realities of slavery and exclusion. But in its simplicity, in its audacity, it offered something radical, an ideal that could outlive its imperfections. Jefferson continued, "that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It was a gospel of freedom, drawn from Locke and Montesquieu, distilled through the American lens. These rights, Jefferson insisted, were not granted by governments. They were born into every human being. Governments did not create them. They existed to protect them. And if they failed to do so, Jefferson answered that too: that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. With that line, rebellion became justified. Treason became duty. The rest of the document built the case. A long list of grievances against King George III followed. Jefferson accused him of violating colonial charters, obstructing justice, keeping standing armies in times of peace, dissolving legislatures, imposing taxes without consent, cutting off trade, and ignoring pleas for redress. He painted the king not as a misguided monarch, but as a tyrant, a villain, a man unfit to rule a free people. The draft was presented to Congress in late June. Debate followed. Edits were made. Some passages, particularly those criticizing the king's role in the transatlantic slave trade, were removed, deemed too divisive for a fragile union. Jefferson was furious, but he accepted the changes. And then, on July 2nd, the vote was taken. 12 colonies voted in favor of independence. New York abstained, lacking authority to approve. The resolution passed, The colonies were no longer colonies. They were states. 2 days later, on July 4th, 1776, the final text of the Declaration of Independence was adopted. It was not signed that day, not by most. That would come later. But the date became a symbol, a birthmark etched into the soul of a new nation. The document was printed, distributed, and read aloud in public squares. In Philadelphia, crowds gathered to hear it. Bells rang. Cannons boomed. In New York, the statue of King George III was pulled down, melted into musket balls. Washington had it read to his troops. Across the colonies, celebrations erupted, followed quickly by the realization that they had just declared war against the most powerful empire on earth. The British, for their part, received the declaration with contempt. The king saw it as confirmation of the colonists' treason. British newspapers mocked its lofty language and accused its authors of hypocrisy. Parliament resolved to crush the rebellion. More troops were sent, more ships. The war would now be fought not to restore order, but to destroy a movement that dared call itself free. But the Declaration had already done something irreversible. It had given the revolution its soul. It transformed a scattered rebellion into a moral cause. It gave ordinary farmers and blacksmiths a reason to risk everything. It told the world that America was not just fighting over taxes or tea, but over principle. It invited France, Spain, and other powers to see the war not as an internal dispute, but as a struggle for human liberty. It also gave birth to myths. The image of the signing, one glorious moment with all the founding fathers gathered around Jefferson's words, is partly fiction. The signatures came over weeks and months. Some delegates never signed at all. But the myth endured, because myths are not meant to be precise. They are meant to inspire. And the Declaration did just that. For centuries, its words would echo across revolutions, civil rights marches, and distant lands. Its promise that all men are created equal would be held up by future generations as a mirror, a weapon, and a prayer. But in 1776, that promise was still fragile. Slavery persisted. Women were excluded. Native Americans were ignored. The road to equality was long, and Jefferson himself did not walk it fully. He owned slaves even as he declared liberty. He knew the contradiction. He felt it. But he did not resolve it. Still the words remained, carved in ink, alive in memory, a declaration like no other. And now, with that declaration made, with muskets loaded and flags unfurled, the revolution entered its next stage. A war not just of armies and battles, but of identity. The colonies had claimed freedom. Now they would have to fight to keep it. Chapter 8. Redcoats and Ragtag Rebels. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry when the storm broke over New York. The summer of 1776 brought more than heat. It brought ships, hundreds of them, black sails crowding the harbor, masts rising like a forest of vengeance. The British had come in full force. This was no longer a conflict of warnings and skirmishes. This was war. General William Howe commanded the British troops, and he did not come alone. He arrived with nearly 32,000 soldiers, well-trained, well-fed, and well-equipped. Alongside them stood Hessian mercenaries from Germany, grim men with curved swords and foreign commands. The goal was clear: crush the rebellion before it could take root. Facing them was George Washington and his Continental Army, just over 20,000 men at the start, most of them untested, farmers with muskets, shoeless boys from backwoods towns, volunteers who had never stood in formation. Washington had courage and conviction, but little else. His army lacked training, uniforms, even gunpowder. But it was all that stood between the British Empire and the dream of American freedom. The campaign for New York began with the Battle of Long Island in late August. The British landed on the western end of Long Island and launched a flanking maneuver that caught the Americans by surprise. It was a disaster. The Continental Army was routed, forced into chaotic retreat, with thousands killed or captured. Washington, realizing he had been outmaneuvered, made a desperate decision. Under cover of darkness and fog, he evacuated his entire army across the East River to Manhattan, silently, stealthily, miraculously. It was not a victory, but it was a salvation. The rebellion lived to fight another day. From there, the British pressed their advantage. One by one, they pushed Washington out of New York, through Harlem, across the Hudson, and into New Jersey. The Continentals lost ground, supplies, and morale. Desertions soared. Many believed the cause was lost. The Congress fled Philadelphia, fearing capture. Independence, it seemed, might die in its infancy. But Washington refused to let go. He understood something that few others did, that victory did not mean winning every battle. It meant enduring, surviving, bleeding but standing. He turned retreat into strategy, using mobility and unpredictability to frustrate British advances. He allowed the British to occupy cities, but denied them control of the countryside. The revolution became not just a war of armies, but of ideas and persistence. Then, in the dead of winter, when all seemed darkest, Washington struck back. It was Christmas night, 1776. The Delaware River was icy and dangerous, but the enemy was vulnerable. The garrison of Hessian troops lay in Trenton, New Jersey, comfortable and unguarded after a holiday feast. Washington gathered his troops, many without shoes, wrapped in rags, some leaving bloody footprints in the snow, and led them across the river in boats. The journey was treacherous. Ice clogged the river. The cold was merciless. 2 men froze to death before even reaching the battle. But by dawn, they were in position. The attack was swift and shocking. The Hessians were caught completely off guard. Musket fire erupted in the narrow streets. Officers scrambled from beds. Within an hour, the battle was over. Nearly 1,000 enemy troops were captured. Not a single American life was lost in combat. It was a stunning reversal. The victory at Trenton electrified the colonies. Newspapers shouted the news in bold letters. Enlistments surged. Morale soared. Washington, once seen as a noble but struggling commander, became the hero of the revolution. He was not finished. A week later, he struck again, this time at Princeton. Another daring attack, another unexpected victory. The British were forced to pull back from much of New Jersey, giving the Americans a brief but precious advantage. The tide had not turned, but it had shifted. Still, the war was far from won. In 1777, the British launched a bold strategy to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada, seizing the Hudson River Valley. General Howe, meanwhile, was expected to move north from New York, and the 2 armies would meet near Albany, splitting the colonies in 2. But the plan unraveled. Howe, instead of marching north, sailed south to capture Philadelphia. He believed that taking the capital would crush the rebellion's heart. He succeeded in taking the city, but found no peace there. Congress had already fled. The revolution was not held in buildings or capitals. It was held in the people. Burgoyne, meanwhile, faced unexpected resistance as he moved south through the dense forests of upstate New York. The American forces, under generals like Horatio Gates and the fiery Benedict Arnold, slowed him at every step. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, supplies dwindled. Local militias rose from the hills like ghosts, striking and vanishing. The climax came at Saratoga. In September and October, two major battles were fought near the town of Stillwater. The Americans held firm. Benedict Arnold, before treason ever touched his name, led a furious charge that broke the British lines. Burgoyne's army, exhausted and surrounded, surrendered on October 17th, 1777. It was one of the most important victories of the entire war. Not just because it stopped the British plan to divide the colonies, but because it changed the world's perception of the Revolution. Until then, European powers had watched from afar, curious, skeptical. But Saratoga proved that the Americans could defeat the British in open battle, and one nation in particular took notice: France. The French had long resented Britain's global dominance. They had lost Canada and much of their colonial empire in the 7 Years' War. The American rebellion was an opportunity, not just for revenge, but for influence. With the victory at Saratoga, Benjamin Franklin, already in Paris as an ambassador, secured what the colonies so desperately needed: an official alliance. In early 1778, France recognized American independence and entered the war. It was a turning point. France brought money, ships, soldiers, and global legitimacy. The war, once a local uprising, became an international conflict. Britain was now fighting not just rebels, but European powers on multiple fronts. Still, in the north, the war dragged on. The British held New York. Washington's army, though growing, remained under constant threat. The winter at Valley Forge tested their spirit. Hunger, disease, and exposure claimed thousands. But it also forged a new army. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, the Continental troops learned discipline, tactics, and coordination. They emerged leaner, harder, and ready to fight. Washington's leadership through it all became legend. He suffered with his men. He inspired by example. He refused to accept defeat. And though he lost more battles than he won, he held the army together. He gave the revolution time to grow, time to mature, time to become real. The North remained contested, but the flame of independence burned brighter with each passing year. The early defeats in New York had nearly ended the dream. The victories at Trenton, Princeton, and Saratoga had revived it. And now, with France at their side and Washington at the helm, the Americans stood no longer as desperate farmers with rifles, but as a people fighting for a nation they had declared, and now began to believe they could win. The war was far from over, but something had changed. The rebels were no longer running. They were learning how to stand. Chapter 9. France joins the fight. The Revolution began as an American struggle, a defiant act by distant colonies against their imperial parent. But by 1778, it had become something much larger. The echo of rebellion that rang through Boston, Trenton, and Saratoga now crossed oceans and rippled through palaces and courts. The world was watching, and in the gilded salons of Paris, where chandeliers caught the firelight and powdered wigs sat atop the heads of nobles and ministers, a single American, elderly, plain, and brilliant, became the unlikely star of a new chapter in the war. His name was Benjamin Franklin. He arrived in France in late 1776, dressed not as a courtier or diplomat, but as himself. No silk, no medals, no military bearing. Just a fur hat, spectacles, and an air of wisdom that no one could quite resist. At 70 years old, Franklin was already a legend. Scientist, printer, inventor, philosopher, statesman. But now he had a new role. Emissary of rebellion. He came not just to seek sympathy, but to secure survival. The American war was costly. The Continental Congress had little money. The army lacked powder, muskets, and boots. Washington's troops starved through the winter. If the rebellion was to last, it needed help. And Franklin's mission was simple and impossible. Convince the French court to join the fight against the most powerful empire on earth. France, for its part, was intrigued. The French had not forgotten the wounds of the 7 Years' War. They had lost Canada, lost pride, lost global influence. Britain had humiliated them, and many in Versailles saw the American uprising as a chance for revenge. But France was cautious. Aiding rebels was risky. Supporting a war across the ocean was expensive. And no one wanted to back a losing cause. Franklin understood this. He knew that France would not commit without proof. Proof that the Americans could stand on their own, that this was not a momentary uprising, but a revolution with teeth. Then came Saratoga. When news reached Paris in late 1777 that General Burgoyne had surrendered his British army to American forces in New York, the mood shifted. The impossible had become reality. The colonists had defeated a major British force in open battle. Suddenly, Franklin's requests didn't sound like desperate hopes, but calculated bets. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans could win. Franklin's charm worked its quiet magic. He dined with nobles, impressed philosophers, and captivated commoners. Parisians wore his image on snuff boxes. Ladies of the court praised his rustic manners and sharp wit. Ministers listened carefully when he spoke. In a court obsessed with appearances, Franklin's simplicity became his strength. But it was not charm alone that won the day. It was politics. France, under the guidance of Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, saw an opportunity not only to weaken Britain, but to restore French prestige. Vergennes was shrewd. He feared that if France delayed too long, Spain or even Britain might make peace with the Americans first. The time to act, he believed, was now. And so, on February 6, 1778, France and the newly declared United States signed 2 treaties. The first was a treaty of amity and commerce, formally recognizing American independence. The second was a treaty of alliance, a military commitment that bound France to join the war against Britain. The effect was immediate and profound. For the first time, the American colonies had a powerful ally. France brought money, which the Revolution desperately needed. It brought supplies, gunpowder, cannons, uniforms, food. It brought troops, professional soldiers trained in European warfare. And it brought naval power, perhaps the most important element of all. Britain had ruled the seas for decades. The Royal Navy had no equal. But now, with France entering the war, Britain faced a global conflict. Its fleets were stretched thin. Its colonies across the Caribbean and Asia were suddenly vulnerable. France didn't just bolster the Americans, it changed Britain's entire strategic map. The war, once centered in the American Northeast, now widened. British commanders had to defend more ground with fewer resources. French warships began disrupting British supply lines. In 1779, Spain joined the war as an ally of France, further complicating British efforts. The Dutch would follow with support of their own. The American rebellion had triggered a global war, and Britain was now fighting on multiple fronts. Back in the colonies, the psychological impact was just as important. The alliance validated the American cause. Independence was no longer a dream. It was a recognized status. The support of France gave heart to the weary. Washington's ragged army now had hope. Congress had access to credit and equipment. And loyalists, who once believed the rebellion would soon collapse, now had reason to worry. Still, the alliance was not a magic solution. The war dragged on. Supplies remained short. The Continental Army continued to suffer. But France's entry shifted the balance, and in time, it would tilt the war decisively. In 1779, French troops under the command of the Comte d'Estaing joined with American forces to attack British positions in the south. The campaign was plagued by miscommunication and ended in failure at Savannah, but the alliance held. In the north, French officers like the Marquis de Lafayette became heroes of the Revolution. Lafayette, just 19 when he arrived in America, became one of Washington's closest allies. He fought bravely, rallied troops, and helped secure continued French aid. But it was at sea that France made its greatest contribution. French ships harassed British convoys, disrupted reinforcements, and forced the Royal Navy to fight in places it hadn't planned. One of the most significant naval victories came not in American waters, but in the Caribbean, where the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse dealt heavy blows to British naval power. These victories paved the way for the final, decisive moment of the war. By 1781, the war's center had shifted to the south. British forces under General Charles Cornwallis had moved through Georgia and the Carolinas, seeking to rally loyalist support and break the back of the rebellion. But they found the South less compliant than expected. Guerrilla fighters, led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, waged brutal, unpredictable campaigns that wore the British down. Cornwallis moved north to Yorktown, Virginia, hoping to resupply and regroup near the coast under the protection of the British Navy. He would not get the chance. Because by then, the alliance Franklin had helped forge in Paris would finally show its full power. George Washington, learning of Cornwallis's position, saw an opportunity. He secretly marched his forces south from New York, linking up with French troops under General Rochambeau. At the same time, Admiral de Grasse sailed from the Caribbean and blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any British escape by sea. The trap was perfect. Cornwallis was surrounded. For weeks, American and French artillery pounded his defenses. Supplies dwindled. His troops were exhausted. And on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The world had indeed taken notice. The Revolution, once seen as a rebellion on the edge of the empire, had become a war that shook the very foundations of that empire. And it was Franklin, with his quiet brilliance, who had helped bring that world to the Revolution's side. The French alliance did not just provide resources. It gave the Revolution credibility, scale, and ultimately, victory. And though the war would not formally end until the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Yorktown broke the British will to continue. As Franklin remained in Paris to negotiate peace, the cause he had once represented as a desperate plea now stood on the threshold of triumph. The world had taken notice, and history would never look away again. Chapter 10. Revolution in the South. By 1780, the war had grown long and bitter. The northern campaigns had ground to a near stalemate, cities occupied, then abandoned, men buried in frozen soil or blistering heat. Washington's army held together through faith and discipline, but it was clear to British strategists that something needed to change. They believed the South would be the key. And so the war shifted, like a storm moving with the wind, down into the fields and swamps of Georgia and the Carolinas, where the terrain was treacherous, the loyalties divided, and the rules of war blurred into the shadows. The British strategy was bold. They believed that the South was full of loyalists, just waiting for the Crown to return order. If they could sweep through Georgia, take Charleston, and push north into the Carolinas and Virginia, they could split the rebellion again, this time from the bottom up. At first, the plan seemed to work. In early 1780, British forces under General Henry Clinton laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the South. The American defenders, outnumbered and cut off, held out for weeks. But in May, they surrendered. It was the single largest loss of American troops in the war. Over 5,000 men taken prisoner. Charleston fell. The British celebrated. Then came the Inland Campaign. General Charles Cornwallis, aggressive and determined, marched his troops through South Carolina and into the backcountry. He expected cooperation. Instead, he found rage. The South was no safe haven for the Crown. It was a land of vendettas, vengeance, and violence. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Entire families split. Churches became recruiting grounds. Barns became armories. The British controlled the cities and roads, but not the hearts of the countryside. Here, in the backwoods and bayous, the revolution became something different. The polished ranks of redcoats found themselves ambushed by men in tattered clothes, firing from behind trees, melting into the woods. There were no battle lines here, only fire, flight, and fury. One name rose from that wilderness: Francis Marion. He was not tall or impressive at first glance. Quiet, wiry, limping from an old injury, Marion seemed more like a farmer than a warrior. But he understood the South. He knew the rivers and swamps like others knew the streets of Boston. He had grown up in the shadows of the pine forests, learned how to track, hunt, and vanish. And in war, he used those skills to devastating effect. Marion led a band of militia that struck with precision and disappeared without a trace. They sabotaged supply lines, freed prisoners, ambushed British patrols, and destroyed bridges. They rode at night, slept in the mud, and lived off the land. To the British, he was a ghost. To his men, he was a legend. They called him the Swamp Fox. His tactics frustrated Cornwallis to no end. Formal engagements gave way to cat-and-mouse games, where British regiments found themselves chasing shadows. Every time they believed that they had him, he vanished again into the marshes. And Marion was not alone. Other Southern commanders like Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens led similar campaigns. The British, hoping for loyalist uprisings, instead found themselves facing a relentless guerrilla war, one that drained their morale and bled their ranks. Loyalist militias formed, but so did patriot ones. The fighting became personal. Entire villages burned. Civilians were caught in the middle. Mercy was rare, vengeance common. Meanwhile, Cornwallis continued his push north. In early 1781, he fought the Battle of Cowpens and lost. It was a masterstroke by General Daniel Morgan, who used a clever double-line tactic to bait the British into a trap. The defeat was humiliating. Cornwallis then pursued the American commander Nathaniel Greene across North Carolina, hoping to crush his army. Greene didn't give him the chance. He led Cornwallis on a long, exhausting chase, stretching supply lines and weakening his enemy. Finally, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis won the field, but at such a cost that it felt like a loss. His army, battered and worn, began limping toward Virginia. The plan to crush the South had begun to unravel. And as the war played out in the swamps and hills, another story unfolded, one of betrayal. His name had once inspired pride. Now it would become synonymous with treason. Benedict Arnold. He had fought bravely for the American cause. At Saratoga, his charge helped turn the tide. He had bled for the Revolution, but something inside him soured. He felt unrecognized, underappreciated, overlooked. He quarreled with superiors. Congress passed him over. His debts grew, his pride swelled. And then he made a choice. He switched sides. Quietly, over months, Arnold communicated with the British. He offered them West Point, the fortress he now commanded, a key strategic point on the Hudson River. If the British took it, they could cut New England off from the rest of the colonies again. It would be a devastating blow. Arnold's plan nearly succeeded. A British officer, Major John Andre, met with him in secret to finalize the arrangements. But Andre was captured. Documents were found. The plot was exposed. Andre was executed. Arnold escaped, fleeing to the British side, where he was given a commission and led troops against the very cause he once defended. His betrayal sent shockwaves through the colonies. If even Benedict Arnold could turn, who could be trusted? Washington was devastated. He had once defended Arnold, considered him a brother in arms. Now Arnold's name became a curse. It embodied every fear of spies, of loyalty undone, of revolution betrayed. Yet, in a strange way, Arnold's betrayal also clarified things. The stakes were no longer political. They were personal. The revolution was not simply a cause, it was a bond. And every man who stayed loyal after that moment knew that betrayal was real, and that choosing the revolution meant risking everything. By the end of 1781, the South was scorched, farms burned, towns emptied. The British still held Charleston and Savannah, but they were losing everywhere else. Their troops were tired, their officers demoralized. And Cornwallis, now in Yorktown, waited for a rescue that would never come. Because while the swamp fox still stirred fear in the forests, a greater force was gathering. Washington, with French troops at his side, was marching south. French ships under Admiral de Grasse closed the Chesapeake Bay, and the trap, like the ones Marion had set in miniature, was now enormous. Cornwallis was about to face not guerrilla raiders, but an army. The war had come full circle. It began with retreat, scattered militias, and desperation. Now it was organized, coordinated, and ready for the final blow. But none of it would have been possible without the South, without the swamps, the sabotage, the night raids, and the men who refused to fight by anyone's rules but their own. And though betrayal had scarred the revolution, the movement had survived it. Because this war, in the end, was not about perfection. It was about persistence. And in the South, it had been fought inch by inch, tree by tree, heart by heart. Chapter 11. Yorktown and the End of War. By the summer of 1781, the war had raged for 6 long years. Cities had burned, fields had been soaked in blood, and the dream of independence had been kept alive not by certainty, but by sheer will. The Americans had suffered defeats and betrayals. They had faced starvation, mutiny, and despair. But they had also earned victories, alliances, and hope. Now the pieces were moving toward their final positions. The board was set for the last act, and all eyes turned to a small tobacco port on the coast of Virginia, Yorktown. General Charles Cornwallis, commander of British forces in the South, had found himself worn down. After his campaign through the Carolinas ended in exhaustion and frustration, he made his way north into Virginia. There, he hoped to resupply, regroup, and strike a blow that might still salvage the war. He chose Yorktown for its location, a defensible port with access to the sea, where British ships could provide support and reinforcements if needed. He did not know that the net was already closing around him. George Washington, encamped near New York, was growing restless. For months he had stared across the water at British-held New York City, hoping for a chance to strike. But the city was too well defended. A frontal assault would be suicide. His army, though improved, still lacked the size and supplies for a direct confrontation. But news was coming from the South. News that Cornwallis was vulnerable. And more importantly, news that the French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, was sailing north from the Caribbean and heading for the Chesapeake Bay. In a moment of brilliant deception, Washington fooled the British into believing he would attack New York. Then, in late August, he began marching his army south, over 400 miles, in blistering heat, through forests and swamps, crossing rivers and mountains. French troops under General Rochambeau marched beside him, their bright white uniforms streaked with dust. Towns along the way erupted in celebration. The sight of French banners alongside the American flag stirred something powerful. For the first time, it felt like this war might actually end. By mid-September, Washington had arrived in Virginia. De Grasse had already blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, preventing any British ships from reaching Yorktown. Cornwallis, still unaware of the size and coordination of the force coming for him, continued to entrench his army. But soon, he would be surrounded. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28, 1781. Washington commanded nearly 9,000 American troops. Rochambeau brought 7,000 more. De Grasse's fleet dominated the sea. Cornwallis was isolated, trapped between a growing army on land and an impenetrable blockade at sea. His only hope was a rescue from New York. But the British Navy was slow to react, and by the time ships were dispatched, it was already too late. Washington moved quickly and methodically. Trenches were dug, artillery positioned. Every day the noose tightened. American and French cannons began their bombardment on October 9th, shaking the earth with every thunderous shot. Shells ripped through British defenses. Redoubt after redoubt fell. Men worked through the night, advancing their lines, dodging musket fire and mortar bursts. Officers shouted through smoke. Trees splintered. Tents burned. The siege was relentless. Cornwallis tried to hold out. He hoped for reinforcements, for miracles. But every day the walls closed in. Supplies dwindled. His men grew weary, their numbers thinning. On October 11th, a second siege line was completed. Closer now, tighter, deadlier. British positions crumbled under the assault. Then came the decisive blow. On October 14th, two key British redoubts, numbers 9 and 10, were stormed in a dramatic nighttime assault. American forces, led by Alexander Hamilton, took one. French troops, under Baron de Viomenil, seized the other. The fighting was fierce, hand to hand, lit by muzzle flashes and screams. Bayonets clashed in the dark. But the positions fell. Cornwallis's last outer defenses were gone. He tried one last desperate move, attempting to ferry his troops across the York River to escape under cover of darkness. But a violent storm scattered his boats. Fate, it seemed, was against him. On October 17th, a white flag was raised. Cornwallis requested a ceasefire to discuss surrender. For Washington, it was a moment of quiet triumph. He had waited years for this, for the chance not just to survive, but to win. He refused to meet Cornwallis personally, sending representatives instead. There would be no ceremony for a man who had led the British cause in the South. Cornwallis, humiliated, pleaded illness and did not attend the formal surrender either, sending his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, in his place. On October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown and laid down their arms. Legend has it that the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." And perhaps it had. The mightiest empire on earth had been forced to kneel to farmers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, and dreamers. The rebellion that had begun with protests and pamphlets had ended with fortifications and artillery. The revolutionaries had not only endured, they had prevailed. The war was not officially over. British forces remained in New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Parliament debated. King George fumed. Diplomats circled the globe. But everyone knew the truth. Yorktown was the end. Back in London, the news landed like a thunderclap. Lord North, the British Prime Minister, reportedly staggered backward when he heard the word surrender. The will to fight evaporated. Voices that had called for peace were now impossible to ignore. The empire could no longer justify the cost. Negotiations began. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin sat at the center of the table. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, nearly 2 years after the siege. The war that had started with a shot in Lexington ended with a signature in Europe. The United States of America was officially recognized as an independent nation. But in the days after Yorktown, before the ink, before the parades, there was only silence. Silence on the battlefield where smoke drifted above broken earth. Silence among the soldiers who buried their comrades and stacked abandoned muskets. Silence in the camps where men who had fought for 6 years now wondered what came next. And silence in the mind of George Washington, who stood among his troops and thought not of celebration, but of peace. He had never craved power. He had refused kingship. He longed for home, for Mount Vernon, for the quiet life stolen by war. And yet he understood that something had changed forever. A new nation had been born, not in the glory of conquest, but in the resolve of endurance. The revolution was not neat. It was not clean. It had cost dearly. Lives lost, families torn, landscapes scarred. But it had kindled something enduring, an idea that governments derived their power not from crowns, but from consent. That liberty was not granted, but claimed. That the world could and should be turned upside down. And in a field outside a small Virginia town, that idea had triumphed. Yorktown was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a story. And the next chapter was waiting to be written. Chapter 12. The Birth of a Fractured Nation. The war was over. The cannons had gone quiet. The treaties had been signed. The British ships had sailed away, their redcoats shrinking on the horizon. American flags now fluttered where Union Jacks had once flown. For the first time in nearly a decade, the colonies, no, the states, stood without a master. Freedom had been won. But peace, it turned out, was no easy reward. What came next was not celebration, but confusion. The enemy was gone. but the road ahead was unpaved, rocky, and uncertain. The country that had fought so hard to throw off the chains of monarchy was now bound by nothing at all. There was no king, no constitution, no central government strong enough to guide 13 fiercely independent states. Victory had delivered liberty, but not direction. The first and most immediate problem was money. The war had left the young nation crippled by debt. Congress had borrowed heavily from France and the Netherlands. States had borrowed even more. Soldiers, many of whom had not been paid in months or even years, now returned home to farms in ruins, businesses lost, and mouths to feed. The continental dollar, once printed with bold optimism, was now worthless. Not worth a continental, people said, laughing bitterly at the paper that had once promised freedom. Inflation soared. Trade collapsed. British merchants, no longer legally tied to their former customers, imposed strict credit terms. Ports that had once buzzed with transatlantic commerce fell quiet. The South, devastated by fighting and British occupation, struggled to rebuild. The North, stripped of its markets and burdened with debt, teetered on economic despair. And Congress, the same Continental Congress that had overseen the war, could do little to help. Under the Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, the national government had no power to tax, no authority to regulate trade, no army, and no executive. It could request money from the states, but could not demand it. It could pass resolutions, but had no means to enforce them. It was a government in name only, paralyzed by the very fear of tyranny that had driven the revolution in the first place. The states, meanwhile, behaved less like siblings and more like rivals. Each printed its own money. Each taxed goods from its neighbors. Each passed laws that conflicted with others. Borders were disputed. Laws were ignored. The idea of a single, united nation was already fraying. In the cities, people wondered if the revolution had gone too far. In the countryside, others feared it hadn't gone far enough. Nowhere was the tension clearer than in the struggle over what freedom truly meant. For white men of property, the revolution had delivered on its promises. They had overthrown foreign rule, gained political power, and inherited a vast new nation. But for many others, freedom remained just out of reach. Enslaved people, whose forced labor had fueled the colony's wealth, found themselves trapped in the same brutal systems they had known before. The Declaration of Independence had proclaimed that all men are created equal. But in the South, that equality stopped at the color line. Slavery not only endured, it expanded. In some northern states, the contradiction was acknowledged. Gradual emancipation laws were passed in places like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. But even there, the path to freedom was slow and partial. And across the new nation, Black Americans who had fought and died for independence now watched as they were written out of its promise. Women, too, who had nursed soldiers, kept farms alive, and in many cases even fought in disguise, returned to a world that expected their silence. The language of the revolution, liberty, equality, representation, had not been written with them in mind. They were mothers of citizens, but not citizens themselves. Their voices remained outside the halls of government. The fight for their rights would have to wait. Native Americans, perhaps more than anyone, paid the price for American independence. Most had sided with the British, who had at least nominally tried to restrain westward expansion. With the British gone, that restraint vanished. Settlers surged past the Appalachians, hungry for land, blind to treaties. Entire tribes were displaced, destroyed, or absorbed. The revolution had not freed them. It had opened the door to their conquest. Even among the victors, bitterness grew. Farmers in western Massachusetts, deep in debt and taxed by a state government dominated by Boston elites, rose up in 1786 in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. Led by a former Revolutionary War captain, Daniel Shays, the rebels closed courthouses and attempted to seize a federal arsenal. Their cry was familiar: no taxation without representation. But now, they were seen not as patriots, but as lawbreakers. The rebellion was put down, but the message rang clear. Freedom without structure was fragile. Liberty, unprotected by law and order, could become chaos. The men who had led the revolution began to worry. George Washington, retired to Mount Vernon, watched with concern as the states drifted. He had not fought a war to see the Union fall apart. James Madison, quiet and brilliant, studied ancient republics and saw the warning signs of collapse. Alexander Hamilton, fiery and impatient, argued for a strong central government. And Thomas Jefferson, writing from Paris, believed revolution was sometimes necessary. But even he feared that the new republic might lose its soul before it ever fully found it. Something had to be done. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia once more, not to declare independence, but to save it. The Constitutional Convention was not a continuation of the Revolution. It was a reckoning. The Articles of Confederation had failed. The states were spinning out of control. The question was no longer how to escape tyranny, but how to build freedom that could last. What emerged was compromise, delicate, flawed, but powerful. The Constitution created a stronger federal government with the power to tax, raise armies, regulate commerce, and make law. It established a separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial, to prevent any one branch from growing too strong. It included a system of checks and balances designed to preserve liberty through tension. And it defined the rights of the people, though many rights, including those of women, indigenous people, and the enslaved, were left undefined or denied entirely. It was not a perfect document, but it was a beginning. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. He took office in New York City, solemn and reluctant. He knew what had been won, but also what could still be lost. The Union was young. The experiment was fragile. The world watched, unsure whether this republic, born in rebellion, could survive peace. In the years that followed, the nation would grow. It would stretch westward. It would industrialize. It would fracture again over slavery, over rights, over power. The revolution would live on, not as a single moment in time, but as a tension always pulling, always questioning. What is freedom? Who gets to claim it? What are its limits? What are its costs? Those questions would haunt the Republic for centuries. They still do. But in 1783, as the last British ships departed and the last cannons were silenced, the people of the United States stood on the edge of a vast and uncertain future. They had no king, no aristocracy, no colonial master, only a fragile union, a patchwork of ideals, and a belief that government could be built not on conquest, but on consent. That belief would be tested, bent, nearly broken, but it would never disappear. Because freedom, once awakened, does not sleep. It demands. It questions. It evolves. And for the nation born in the fires of revolution, it became both the promise and the burden of every generation that followed. Chapter 13. The Revolution's Legacy. when the muskets fell silent and the flags were furled, when the treaties were signed and the British crown acknowledged defeat, a new nation emerged into the light of history. The American Revolution had ended. But the real reckoning was just beginning. Every war leaves behind questions. Every revolution draws lines between those who rise and those who fall, those who are remembered and those who are erased. The American Revolution was no exception. Its victories were loud, its failures were quieter. But both shaped the country it would become, and the world it would eventually change. The most obvious winners were the white male patriots who had led the cause. They had fought to rid themselves of foreign rule, and they had succeeded. They created a government not built on bloodline or nobility, but on law and consent. The Founding Fathers became legends. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, etched into statues, into textbooks, into memory. They defined what freedom meant, or at least what it meant for them. Their ideas would ripple far beyond America's borders, inspiring revolutions in France, in Latin America, even in parts of Africa and Asia centuries later. But not every revolutionary was lifted equally by victory. Women, though indispensable to the war effort, remained on the margins of the political system they had helped protect. They ran farms and shops while men went to war. They acted as nurses, spies, messengers. Some disguised themselves as men to fight. They raised funds, raised children, and raised the alarm when British troops were near. Yet when the dust settled, they were still denied the right to vote, to hold office, to shape the laws that now govern their lives. A few voices spoke up. Abigail Adams had warned her husband to remember the ladies when forming the new government. He didn't. Most men in power believed women belonged in the home, not the halls of Congress. And so the promise of the revolution bypassed half the population. Women were praised for their virtue, their sacrifice, their motherhood, but not their minds. The country would need another revolution, and then another, to begin fulfilling that unfinished promise. For enslaved people, the contradiction was unbearable. The Declaration of Independence had declared that all men were created equal. But in the South, that principle stopped at the plantation gate. Slavery had not only survived the Revolution, it had been protected by it. Many of the Founding Fathers owned slaves. Jefferson, the very man who penned those famous words, kept hundreds in bondage throughout his life. The Constitution, drafted in the aftermath, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, not to give them rights, but to give slave states more power in Congress. Yet even in chains, the idea of liberty found fertile soil. Thousands of enslaved people ran away during the war. Some joined the British, who offered freedom in exchange for loyalty. Others joined the patriot cause, hoping their service would be rewarded with manumission. A few were freed. Most were not. In northern states, the Revolution triggered gradual emancipation. Slavery was slowly abolished in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and others. But in the South, it became even more entrenched, more profitable, more defended, more violent. The ideals of the Revolution had opened a door, but it would take generations of struggle, rebellion, and civil war to walk through it. Native Americans, meanwhile, suffered some of the greatest losses. They had not been invited to Philadelphia. They had not signed the Declaration. They had not been consulted on the shape of the new republic. Most tribes had sided with the British, hoping to protect their lands from colonial expansion. That decision sealed their fate. When the British lost, they abandoned their native allies. The new United States, eager for land and indifferent to treaty obligations, turned its gaze westward. The proclamation line that had once protected Indian territory under British rule was erased. Settlers poured across the Appalachians, hungry for farmland, armed with muskets and blessed by the illusion of divine right. Tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy, once powerful and feared, were fractured by the war. Others, like the Shawnee, Creek, and Cherokee, found themselves in a new world order, surrounded, outnumbered, and under siege. Some fought, some negotiated, some tried to adapt. But the revolution had not liberated them. It had cleared the way for their dispossession. And what of the Loyalists? Tens of thousands of Americans had remained faithful to the British Crown. They had believed that the rebellion was reckless, illegal, doomed. Many were wealthy merchants, Anglican clergy, or royal officials. Others were ordinary people who valued stability over revolution. They had fought for Britain, spied for Britain, prayed for British victory. When that victory never came, they were cast out. Their homes were burned. Their lands were seized. They were beaten, humiliated, exiled. Nearly 100,000 Loyalists fled, some to Canada, others to the Caribbean, to England, or further still. They lost everything. Families were torn apart. Lifelong neighbors became enemies. The revolution had not only been a war between nations, it had been a civil war, and its scars ran deep. Yet for all its failures and exclusions, the American Revolution had planted seeds that would one day grow beyond its contradictions. The idea that people could govern themselves without kings was revolutionary in every sense. The notion that power came from the people, not the throne, shook monarchies around the world. The French Revolution followed in its wake. So did struggles for independence across Latin America. The age of revolution had begun, and the revolution also transformed the American identity. Before the war, people had been Virginians, or New Yorkers, or Carolinians. Afterward, they were Americans. The country remained divided, by region, by class, by race. But a common language had emerged. Liberty, representation, republic. The Constitution that followed, flawed as it was, provided a framework for something the world had never seen. A sprawling, diverse democratic experiment. Fragile, imperfect, but alive. The revolution also forced a confrontation with hypocrisy. If all men were created equal, what of those enslaved? If liberty was unalienable, why did women remain voiceless? If government was by consent, what of the people whose lands were taken without even a hearing? These questions would haunt the nation. They still do. But they were questions made possible by the revolution itself. Without that first radical break, that first assertion of rights, there would be no ground to stand on, no rhetoric to call back to, no moral code to demand fulfillment. That is perhaps the truest legacy of the revolution. Not that it perfected freedom, but that it introduced the idea into the bloodstream of a new nation. It gave the oppressed a vocabulary. It gave the marginalized a flag to claim. It gave reformers, abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, and countless others a foundation to build upon and to challenge. In the end, the American Revolution was not a single moment. It was a beginning, a promise, a contradiction wrapped in thunder. Some won, some lost. All were changed. The war that started with angry words in Boston and ended with a surrender in Virginia reshaped the world. It showed that ordinary people could overthrow kings, that governments could be created from below, that liberty, however limited at first, could expand. The world looked on and took note. And in every generation since, someone has pointed back to those words written in 1776, those simple, radical, impossible words, and asked the question that will never truly be answered. What does freedom mean? The revolution never ended. It just passed into other hands.